ago in England in 1592, there begins our tale, and all of it is true. Through all of London, bubonic plague spread, covering folk in weeping sores and leaving thousands dead.
Hi, welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. Today's episode considers Astrologaster, a narrative-based comedy game set in Elizabethan London. The narrative follows the curious medical career of Simon Forman, who pursues a medical license while treating his patients with a mixture of medicine and astrological readings. Forman's work finds him not only diagnosing physical ailments, but also advising patients on financial and career opportunities, as well as predicting their future love lives. The story weaves in well-known elements of Elizabethan life, including references to Shakespeare, crypto-Catholicism, colonial exploration, and, in a nice nod to Blackadder, Sir Walter Raleigh and potatoes. My guest on today's show is University of Cambridge professor Lauren Kassell, who served as a historical consultant on the game. Astrologaster is inspired largely by her work on Simon Forman's real-life casebooks, which she explored in detail in her book, Medicine and Magic in Elizabethan London. Over the last decade, Dr. Kassell and a team of scholars have converted Forman's original paper casebooks into a searchable digital archive that includes some 80,000 case records. Lauren, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much for taking an interest in Astrologaster and my research.
Of course. So given that he's the protagonist of this game, I suppose we should start with Simon Forman. Could you give our audience a brief background on his career as an astrologer/physician?
Certainly. If you wanted to make up a character that was sort of larger than life, a little bit nasty, interested in sex, dabbled in things to do with the devil, you would invent Simon Forman. But he was a real person. And the fact that he lived this very colorful life and then was picked up by various literary authors over the centuries is one of the reasons why he seems like a stock character. He was born to a sort of middling family, a family that was on their way down in Wiltshire. And we know a little bit about his early life because he wrote accounts of his life. So we have to take it all with a pinch of salt. He apparently had a great passion for learning, but he had to go and be apprenticed to a grocer. And one of the other boys who had some book learning shared his books with Foreman, and that's how Foreman learned to read. Reading and writing became one of the keys to his life. And then he managed to go up to Oxford for a year or two as a sort of servant to some wealthier young men. But they were more interested, Foreman says, in hunting and chasing girls than he was at that stage. And so it didn't really work out, and it's not clear how much he really learned while he was there. And then there's some sort of lost years where we don't quite know what he was doing. And then what we really know about is when he's around the age of 40, he arrives in London and he sets himself up as an aspiring astrologer-physician. And to his great advantage, the plague arrives. Again, this is all his version of things. Mm-hmm. And he gets sick. And he's about to die, and he's got some potion that he had previously made sitting next to him, and I think his servant gives it to him to drink, and he is revived. And that, based on that, then he treats other people with the method that he used on himself. And that was what launched his success as an astrologer-physician in Elizabethan London. It also was what led to a lot of his troubles, because you weren't allowed to just rock up in London and practice medicine. Medicine was regulated by the College of Physicians. So they, notoriously physicians, they're wealthy people, they often treated the elite, they would leave the city along with the other rich people when plague struck, because you were less likely to contract it out in the countryside. And so there was a sort of gap in the market, right? Plague is happening, it's terrible. So these other practitioners, we call them irregular practitioners because they fall outside the layers of regulation, and they could set up shop. So Foreman didn't just set up shop, he aspired to work as a full-blown physician. He aspired to garner the patronage of elite clients. And that really, really irritated the College of Physicians, the regulatory body. So when they all came back, they started what would be a 15-year, 20-year pursuit of Foreman. For the rest of his life, he was dogged by the College of Physicians, and they tried to stop him from practicing, and they never really succeeded, though they scared him an awful lot.
Mm-hmm. You get a good sense of that from the game. It is an interesting story whenever you combine the word fortunate and plague in the same sentence. That's quite a career. I'm wondering, how common were astrologers and astrological readings at this time? Was it common for people to associate medicine with horoscopes and vice versa?
People associated medicine with astrology. So there was a kind of medical astrology that was taught at the universities. If you were a physician, you needed to know that you didn't let blood when the moon was in certain phases, for instance. Timing and illness, they're always associated. And so the doctrine of critical days said that an illness was likely to peak at its 7th, 14th, or 20th day, which meant that you, as you gave a prognosis, you were trying to measure when a disease started and when, therefore, it might conclude. Because what you wanted as a doctor was a good result. So you knew that fundamentally nature was working with you, and if you could work with nature, then you had a much greater chance of healing somebody. So astrology is about time, and it's also about language. It's a way of expressing what's going on within this huge cosmological scheme. But what Foreman and Napier is Foreman's protege. So what they're doing when they are consulted by a client isn't conventional medical astrology. What they're doing is what we call horary astrology, which is not based on the time that a person was born and their fortune, but that's what we would think of as a nativity or a horoscope, right? Mm-hmm. And you can project a person's life from the moment they're born based on the planetary positions forward in time. Foreman and Napier, they do that kind of astrology, but not very much. What they are really interested in is this horary astrology, which is based on the moment at which somebody asks them a question. So this is a form of interrogation. And this is slightly bonkers, right? That the idea that the moment that the question is asked, or the moment that the message arrives from a messenger, because some of the consultations are done in writing, that moment somehow relates to that person's health and well-being is crazy. This is fortune telling, right? Mm-hmm. It's also, what anyone who's ever done the I Ching, or this is how you're putting together a range of combinations and seeing what that gives you, right? And then you will measure it against other signs, how the person looks, how the person feels, what people have told you about how the person looks or how the person feels, various excrements coming out of the body, most commonly urine. You might, but these astrologers didn't, you might feel their pulse. So you put all the stellar signs together with your somatic signs, your bodily signs, and you can come up with a diagnosis if it's not, if the first thing you check is whether this is an okay relationship that you have with this person, right? The first thing the astrologer checks is whether or not he should even meddle with this case at all, because as with all doctors, they want a positive outcome. And so they're looking for the cause of the disease, and by working out what the cause of the disease is, they can then work out whether or not they can help the person. So are other people doing this? That was your question. How
Yes.
common are astrologers and astrological readings at the time? Throughout Europe, there are plenty of astrologers. They come in a variety of different sorts. They're super learned guys who can be found in universities and often in courts. These are really very, very able mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, and so forth. Some of them write books, some of them don't write books, but they're really well respected, even if they do things that are controversial. People like to fight, particularly like to fight in print in these centuries. And then you also had astrologers who were like marketplace astrologers, who were more like fortune tellers.
Mm-hmm.
So we know about a lot of these people, and we know that they're on the up in this era. And we also know that when you get to a few decades after Foreman, that England is crawling with astrologers. What we don't know is who the astrologers, like how many of them there really were when Foreman was practicing. Probably several dozen, but we're not certain. But then we know that there are lots more, and
Mm-hmm.
that there are, it becomes possible to learn the art of astrology not only from being taught by somebody, just as Napier was taught by Foreman, but a number of texts get written, some circulating in manuscript. Foreman wrote one of these that circulated in manuscript, and then they start to be printed. And once you have a printed manual, you can work out how to become an astrologer all by yourself. But what's really unusual about Foreman and then about Napier is that their records were written out so systematically and that their records survive. And so we can put them on an extreme end of a spectrum, but they're not from Mars. There are other people who are doing this sort of thing. It's just they did it so systematically. They were consulted at least 2,000 times a year, each of them, and what they wrote down survived. So that's what makes them so unusual in the records.
Sure. Yeah. Could you tell us a bit more about the casebooks themselves? The game provides you with a brief casebook summary of the patient examination and an astrological reading after each visit. But I'm wondering how closely those entries mimic the real-life casebooks.
The real-life casebooks are more beautiful. The real-life casebooks, they are very formulaic, but the reason I say they're more beautiful is that they're built around the astrological chart, right? And in the game, you look at the chart separately from the case summary.
Yes.
The astrologers don't use columns. I don't have the game open in front of me, but my recollection is that the case summary, it's very regimented. It looks like a form that you might fill out. Whereas the astrologers wrote in, they follow headings, but they don't, it's not written out quite. So it's not, there's very little prose in the records, right? It starts with the name, age, possibly their address, the date and time at which the question is asked, and then there's usually the question that is asked, right? And all of that is just written down as a matter of course. And then beneath that, they drew the horoscope of the planetary positions at that moment, and then they wrote out some astrological readings, and then they wrote out the judgment. And we don't even know why they used the format that they did, but they typically took a large piece of paper. In fact, they're using notebooks. So the size of one of their pages in their notebooks was like the size of a piece of one of our regular pieces of paper. And they would divide that into 4. So they're thinking in grids for some reason. So then, but they don't follow any of their grids, but they will try. So we would typically have 4 cases on one page, and in the middle of each case, you would have a square. And that's why I say they're more beautiful than what you get in the summary of the case in the game, because they're very striking as documents. Yeah, they're very, very beautiful documents, but the information about the patients or the clients that we get in the game does roughly follow what we get in the casebooks, except is that because we're trying to progress your way through the game, it tells you where you are, right? And the casebooks are, that's one of the reasons why we needed to edit and database them, is that they just really deal with that case. And the moment that person was talking to the astrologer, occasionally the astrologer will say, see 2 weeks back.
Okay.
Or you can tell it's in a different ink, and he'll say she died, or he was delivered of twins, right? So you start to get a little bit of forwards and backwards, but not really. And you certainly don't get anything about which is the mission of the game, the you've pleased or displeased.
Right. Letters of recommendation.
Yeah, exactly.
Letters of reference. Yeah. I can understand why they included that as a mechanic, though. Especially as a player, there's got to be kind of an endpoint, a purpose to the game. But as a historian, it sounds like the casebooks are a bit more interesting. Well, just kind of as a final question, I mean, how does it feel to have your research turned into a game? Is there anything, for instance, that you hope players get out of this?
I think it's really funny that my research has been turned into a game. I'm enormously proud of what Astrologaster is, which there were moments when I wasn't sure that's how I would feel. But as I saw it develop, I realized that it's clever, it's funny, it's fun, and it's extremely beautiful. And I only saw it take shape sort of slowly. And then they turned around and did crazy things, like they put not only the voices, which weren't part of the original plan, but they put the music into the game.
The magical singers are fantastic. They're fantastic.
Who's this man at the door who we've not seen before?
Who's this man at the door who we've not seen before?
Who is come to inquire the rest in so strange a time? Tis
Signor Ferraro.
So, there I was. I mean, we would laugh because I would get very literal-minded and fuss over trivial details. That was my job, to be the pedantic historian. But what they were creating was this, the casebooks are about medical encounters. They record a performance. And what we have on the screen when you play the game is the performance and, the animation of the casebooks. I couldn't have, if somebody said to me, here's a bunch of money, you can commission some game developers to make a game, we wouldn't have come up with something this good. And I guess that's really the lesson for me. And we did, we worked with artists, we did commission, in a sense, some work to relate to the casebooks, our work on casebooks. But I think actually the best work comes when the creative people come to the historians. And so what I would hope is that games like Astrologaster will help to open those channels, ensure that more game developers will go to historians or other forms of experts, and at the same time that more experts will say yes when the request comes through, and that the business will be able to be conducted with the kind of respect, mutual respect, that I shared with Jennifer, Catherine, and the rest of the team.
Well, on that hopeful note, that does it for today's episode. Lauren, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Bob, very much for talking with me.
If you enjoyed today's episode of History Respawn, please consider supporting our show by going to patreon.com/History Respawn. Until next time, goodbye.